In the heart of what would one day be called Iraq, between two great rivers whose waters have carved their stories into the earth for millennia, there existed a land that breathed with the rhythm of human ambition. The Tigris and Euphrates, those ancient arteries of life, wound their way through vast plains of silt and clay, depositing the rich black earth that would nurture the first flowering of civilization. This was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where the morning sun cast long shadows across endless fields of barley and emmer wheat, and where the evening light turned the mudflats into mirrors of burnished copper. The air here carried the scent of river water, mixing with sun-baked earth, the sweet fragrance of date palms heavy with fruit, and the distant smoke of countless hearth fires sending thin ribbons of grey into the endless sky. Along the riverbanks, where reeds swayed in the gentle current and ibis picked their way through the shallows, the first cities of mankind rose like islands of ambition from the fertile plain. These were not the sprawling metropolises that would later dominate the landscape of human imagination, but something more intimate, more connected to the rhythms of season and flood, each one a small universe unto itself. The people who built these cities had learned to read the language of the rivers, understanding when the annual floods would come sweeping down from the distant mountains, bringing with them the life-giving silt that would renew the fields. They developed intricate systems of canals and irrigation ditches, creating a network of waterways that transformed the natural flooding into a controlled blessing. The sound of water moving through these channels became the heartbeat of civilization, a constant murmur that accompanied the daily rituals of planting and harvesting, of crafting and trading. Within the walls of these early city-states, life moved to ancient rhythms that had been passed down through generations of farmers and artisans. The potter's wheel turned slowly in workshops filled with the earthy smell of wet clay, while nearby, the metalsmith's hammer rang against bronze in a steady percussion that echoed through narrow streets. Scribes bent over clay tablets in the cool interiors of temples and administrative buildings, their reed styluses creating the wedge-shaped marks that would preserve contracts, prayers, and stories for thousands of years to come. Each city-state existed as its own small cosmos, ruled by a lugal or ensi, who served as both political leader and high priest to the city's patron deity. These rulers dwelt in palaces that rose above the common buildings like artificial mountains, their walls decorated with glazed bricks that caught and reflected the light in brilliant blues and yellows. The greatest of these structures was often the ziggurat, a stepped pyramid that reached toward heaven, its terraced sides planted with gardens that cascaded down in green waterfalls of vegetation. Stood proud beside the Euphrates, its white limestone walls gleaming in the desert sun, while within its boundaries, merchants from distant lands gathered in the marketplace to exchange goods that had travelled along trade routes stretching across continents. The scent of frankincense mingled with that of cedarwood from the mountains of Lebanon, while bolts of silk from far-off lands lay beside locally woven wool dyed in rich purples and crimsons. The voices of traders, speaking in dozen different tongues, created a constant background hum of commerce and negotiation. To the northeast, Babylon emerged as another jewel of civilization, its hanging gardens already legendary among travelers who spoke in hushed tones of green terraces that seemed to float in the air, defying the harsh reality of the surrounding desert. The city's walls enclosed not just homes and workshops, but also schools where young scribes learned the complex art of cuneiform writing, their fingers growing calloused from endless hours of pressing reed into clay. Further north, along the banks of the Tigris, the city of Ashur developed its own distinctive character, its people becoming renowned as traders who could navigate both the treacherous currents of the river and the equally dangerous channels of international commerce. Their boats, constructed from bundled reeds and sealed with bitumen, carried cargo both mundane and precious along waterways that connected mountain to sea, desert to fertile plain. These cities existed in a delicate balance of cooperation and competition, their relationships shifting like the channels of the rivers themselves. Sometimes they would unite in the face of external threats, their armies marching together beneath banners that bore the symbols of their patron gods. Other times, they would turn against each other, their conflicts played out on battlefields where bronze clashed against bronze, and the outcome would determine which city would collect tribute from the others. The people who lived in this world understood their place in a cosmic order that stretched from the underworld ruled by Ereshkigal to the heavens, where Anu held court among the stars. Their daily lives were punctuated by festivals that honored the gods who controlled the forces of nature. Elaborate ceremonies where priests poured libations of beer and oil onto temple altars while the smoke of burning incense rose toward the sky. The calendar itself was structured around these religious observances, with each month dedicated to different aspects of divine will. In the fields that surrounded these urban centers, farmers worked the land with tools their ancestors had used for generations, following agricultural practices that had been refined over centuries of trial and success. The plough, pulled by oxen whose hooves left deep impressions in the soft earth, created furrows that ran straight as arrows toward the horizon. Women walked along these rows, scattering seeds with practiced motions that seemed almost like a dance, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of ancient songs that carried practical wisdom about planting times and weather signs. The sound of grinding grain echoed from courtyard to courtyard each morning, as women knelt beside stone querns, their strong hands turning grain into flour that would become the bread that sustained life itself. Children played in the dusty streets between houses built of sun-dried brick, their laughter mixing with the calls of vendors selling everything from fresh fish caught in the river to pottery vessels glazed in brilliant colors. As evening approached each day, the cities would gradually quiet, the bustle of commerce giving way to the more intimate sounds of families gathering for the evening meal. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, casting warm golden light that spilled onto streets where dogs wandered in search of scraps and cats stalked silently through shadows. The night air carried the sound of music drifting from taverns where workers gathered to drink beer brewed from barley and sweetened with dates, their voices joining in songs that celebrated both the joys and sorrows of human existence. This was the world that existed before empire, a constellation of independent cities, each following its own destiny, while remaining connected to the others through bonds of trade, culture, and shared understanding of divine will. The stage was set in this land between the rivers, where the ambitions of gods and mortals would soon converge to create something unprecedented in human history. From these flourishing city-states scattered across the Fertile Crescent like jewels upon ancient silk, there emerged a figure whose origins remained shrouded in the mists of time and legend. Sargon of Akkad, whose very name would echo through millennia as the architect of humanity's first true empire, began life in circumstances that storytellers would later weave into myth and historians would struggle to untangle from folklore. The man who would unite Mesopotamia under a single crown first drew breath in an age when such unity seemed as impossible as capturing the wind or taming the mighty rivers themselves. The earliest accounts of Sargon's birth read like ancient poetry, rich with symbolism that speaks to the profound impact this child would have upon the world. According to the legends that survived on clay tablets worn smooth by countless hands, his mother was a priestess, a temple servant sworn to celibacy, dwelling in the sacred precincts where incense burned perpetually and hymns rose like morning mist toward the heavens. His father remained unnamed, a shadow figure lost to history, though some whispered he was a man of noble blood who could never claim his son. The circumstances of Sargon's conception carried the weight of transgression, a breaking of sacred vows that would have brought shame upon the temple and death upon the mother who bore him. In those distant days, when the gods walked closer to earth and their voices could be heard in the rustling of reeds along the riverbank, unwanted children faced fates as harsh as the desert winds. The priestess, heavy with child and burdened by the knowledge of what discovery would bring, made a choice that would echo through the ages. Rather than face the consequences of her transgression, she wove a basket from the bulrushes that grew in abundance along the water's edge. their hollow stems perfect for creating a vessel both sturdy and light. With tender hands that trembled with both love and desperation, she sealed the tiny craft with bitumen, the same black substance that builders use to waterproof the foundations of temples and palaces. The newborn Sargon, swaddled in cloth that had known the touch of sacred oils and temple incense, was placed within this humble ark while the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. His mother carried him through the darkness to where the Euphrates flowed broad and deep, its waters reflecting the distant fires of settlements along its banks. There, with prayers upon her lips and tears streaming down her face like the first rains of spring, she released the basket into the current that had carried the hopes and sorrows of countless generations before. The river, eternal and indifferent, accepted its precious cargo and bore it away into the night, while the priestess returned to her temple duties as if nothing had changed, though her heart would forever hold the echo of that moment when the waters claimed her child. The basket drifted through the pre-dawn hours when the world lay hushed and waiting, carried by currents that had carved their channels when the earth was young. Fish swam in silver schools beneath the tiny vessel, while herons stood motionless in the shallows like sentinels guarding the boundaries between water and land. The first light of morning painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, illuminating the palm groves and grain fields that stretched away from the river's edge like a vast green carpet woven by divine hands. It was in these early hours, when the air still held the coolness of night and the promise of the day lay unbroken, that fate intervened in the form of a simple man whose daily routine would change the course of human history. Akki, the water drawer, moved through his morning tasks with the unhurried grace of one whose life followed the rhythm of seasons and the needs of growing things. His work was humble but essential, carrying water from the life-giving river to the palace gardens where exotic plants from distant lands grew under careful cultivation. The date palms, heavy with fruit, the flowering shrubs that perfumed the evening air, the vegetable plots that fed the royal household. All depended upon his steady labour and the precious water he drew each dawn from the Euphrates. On this particular morning, as golden light began to dance upon the water's surface, and the first merchants appeared on the distant roads with their laden donkeys, Akki noticed something unusual floating among the reeds where herons nested and water birds made their morning calls. The basket bobbed gently in the shallow water near the bank, its bitumen seal intact and its cargo dry despite the night's journey. Akki waded into the cool water, his feet sinking slightly into the soft mud where countless generations of river dwellers had walked before him. When he lifted the basket from its watery cradle, he discovered within it a child whose eyes already held an unusual intensity, as if the infant somehow comprehended the magnitude of the journey just completed. The baby's cry, when it came, was strong and clear, carrying across the water to where ibises preened their feathers and turtles sunned themselves on fallen logs. Without hesitation, born of a generous heart that saw need before circumstance, Akki gathered the foundling to his chest and carried him home through streets beginning to stir with the day's activities. Merchants arranged their wares in the marketplace, bakers fired their ovens for the day's bread, and children played games as old as civilization itself in the dusty spaces between houses built of sun-dried brick. The palace gardens where Akki tended his charges lay peaceful in the morning light, a sanctuary of ordered beauty where water channels flowed in geometric patterns and fruit trees cast dappled shadows upon carefully raked earth. Here, in surroundings far humbler than the royal chambers where future conquests would be planned, Sargon spent his earliest years learning the patient arts of cultivation and care. Akki, whose own children had grown and established households of their own, welcomed this unexpected addition to his family with the quiet acceptance of one who understood that the river gives as freely as it takes. The child thrived under this tender care, growing strong and alert among the garden plots where vegetables grew in neat rows and flowers bloomed according to seasons, known since the world began. The palace gardens became young Sargon's classroom, though he knew nothing yet of the destiny that awaited beyond their peaceful boundaries. He learned to read the subtle signs that spoke of plant health and soil condition, to understand the delicate balance between water and sun that made life flourish in this land between the rivers. His small hands grew skilled at the gentle tasks of tending growing things, while his keen eyes observed the endless procession of palace life that flowed around the gardens like water around stones in a stream bed. Servants hurried along covered walkways on errands whose importance he could not yet fathom, their sandaled feet whispering against stone floors, polished smooth by countless passages. Scribes carried clay tablets marked with the wedge-shaped symbols that held within their angular forms the power to preserve human thought across vast distances of time and space. Guards stood watch, with bronze-tipped spears gleaming in the sun, their presence a reminder that even in these peaceful gardens, the wider world held dangers and conflicts that required constant vigilance. Through the latticed windows that looked out upon Aki's domain, young Sargon sometimes glimpsed the royal family and their retinue, figures whose lives seemed to unfold according to ceremonies and protocols as ancient and immutable as the movements of stars across the night sky. Their robes rustled with the whisper of fine linen. Their jewelry caught the light like captured fragments of sun and moon, and their voices carried the measured cadences of those born to command the attention of others. Yet none who passed through those gardens in those early years could have imagined that the foundling child tending plants with quiet concentration would someday eclipse them all, his name remembered long after theirs had faded into the anonymous dust of ages. In this sanctuary of growing things, surrounded by the patient wisdom of one who understood the profound mysteries hidden in soil and seed, Sargon's character took shape like clay under a potter's knowing hands. The discipline required for successful gardening, the attention to detail that meant the difference between abundance and failure, the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing life through its cycles of growth and rest, all these lessons seeped into his developing consciousness like water absorbed by thirsty roots. Though he could not know it then, these early years spent among the ordered beauty of palace gardens were preparing him for the far greater task of cultivating an empire that would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, uniting diverse peoples under his rule, as surely as Aki's careful irrigation united scattered plots into a single, flourishing whole. The shadows of history part like morning mist to reveal the moment when destiny began to stir in the heart of a young man whose name would echo through millennia. Sargon, having emerged from the obscurity of his mysterious beginnings, found himself positioned at the crossroads of ambition and opportunity in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. The great Sumerian city-states, jewels of civilization that had dominated the landscape for over 1,000 years, stood proud and seemingly eternal across the alluvial plains, their ziggurats rising like geometric mountains against the endless sky. In those days, the air itself seemed thick with the weight of ancient traditions and the murmur of countless voices speaking in the lilting cadences of Sumerian, a language that had given birth to writing and law. The city-states of Uruk, Lagash, and Umma sprawled along the waterways like pearls on silver threads, each one a world unto itself, governed by priest-kings who claimed divine mandate and surrounded by walls that had never known defeat by a unified enemy. The scent of incense drifted perpetually from temple complexes, where rituals older than memory continued without pause, while in the markets, merchants haggled over precious metals and exotic goods brought by caravan from distant lands. Sargon's ascent began not with the clash of bronze upon bronze, but with the quiet accumulation of influence and the careful cultivation of alliances among those who had grown weary of the endless squabbling between neighboring city-states. The Akkadian people, speakers of a Semitic tongue that differed markedly from Sumerian, had long lived in the shadow of their southern neighbors, serving as traders, mercenaries, and administrators in the great cities while maintaining their own settlements in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. Their language rolled differently from Sumerian lips, carrying with it the rhythms of desert winds and nomadic traditions that stretched back through generations of oral history. The moment of transformation arrived when Sargon, having established himself as a figure of considerable authority in the region around his new capital city of Akkad, cast his gaze southward toward the glittering prizes of Sumer. The political landscape of the time resembled a complex mosaic of shifting alliances and perpetual conflicts, with each city-state jealously guarding its independence, while simultaneously engaging in the intricate dance of diplomacy and warfare that had characterized Mesopotamian politics for centuries. The rulers of these ancient cities, secure in their palace complexes adorned with lapis lazuli and gold, could scarcely have imagined that their world was about to be irrevocably transformed by a man whose origins remained shrouded in mystery and myth. The first campaigns unfolded like thunder rolling across the plain, beginning with swift strikes against the northernmost Sumerian settlements. Sargon's forces, composed of disciplined Akkadian warriors, supplemented by mercenaries and allies drawn from across the region, moved with a coordination and purpose that caught their enemies unprepared. The bronze-tipped spears of his soldiers gleamed in the harsh Mesopotamian sun as they advanced in formations that spoke of careful planning and extensive training, while the sound of their marching feet created a rhythm that would soon become the heartbeat of empire. Kish fell first, its ancient walls proving insufficient against the tactical innovations that Sargon brought to the art of warfare. The composite bow, capable of sending arrows farther and with greater force than traditional designs, became a signature weapon of the Akkadian military, raining death from distances that rendered ineffective the close-quarters tactics favored by Sumerian city militias. The city's temples, which had stood inviolate for centuries, witnessed the unprecedented sight of foreign soldiers moving through their sacred precincts, though Sargon was careful to show respect for the gods and maintain the religious institutions that provided legitimacy and continuity to his conquests. The conquest of each successive city-state followed a pattern that would become the template for imperial expansion throughout history. Initial resistance, fierce but ultimately futile, gave way to negotiation and eventual capitulation as the futility of opposing Sargon's growing power became apparent to even the most stubborn defenders. The walls of Ur, massive constructions of sun-baked brick that had protected the city for generations, crumbled not under siege engines but under the weight of political reality, as the city's leaders recognized that accommodation offered better prospects than destruction. Within the conquered cities, life continued with a strange mixture of continuity and transformation. The morning call to prayer still echoed from temple towers, but now Akkadian administrators sat alongside Sumerian priests in council chambers, where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made daily. Markets bustled with the same energy as before, but now merchants calculated profits in standards set by Akkadian bureaucrats who maintained meticulous records in both Sumerian cuneiform and their own adapted script. The scent of barley beer and baking bread remained unchanged in narrow streets where children played games whose rules had been passed down through generations. Yet these same streets now echoed with the footsteps of Akkadian soldiers making their rounds. Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh, presented the greatest challenge to Sargon's ambitions. Its walls stretched for miles around an urban complex that housed tens of thousands of inhabitants, and its temples contained treasures accumulated over centuries of successful trade and conquest. The siege that followed became the stuff of legend, with Akkadian forces employing innovative tactics, including the systematic diversion of water supplies and the construction of massive earthworks that allowed attackers to approach the city's defenses from previously impossible angles. The fall of Uruk sent ripples of shock throughout the remaining independent city-states, as the psychological impact of this victory proved as valuable as any military advantage. The integration of conquered territories required administrative innovations that would influence governmental structures for millennia to come. Sargon established a system of governors drawn from both Akkadian and Sumerian nobility, creating a hybrid administration that maintained local customs while ensuring loyalty to the central authority. Royal roads began to stretch across the empire like a vast nervous system, carrying messages and goods with unprecedented efficiency between distant provinces. Way stations and supply depots dotted these routes, providing rest for travelers and serving as focal points for the collection of taxes and tribute that flowed steadily toward Akkad. The cultural synthesis that emerged from these conquests created something entirely new in human history. Sumerian artistic traditions began to incorporate Akkadian motifs and themes, while Akkadian craftsmen learned techniques that had been refined in Sumerian workshops for centuries. Temple complexes expanded to accommodate deities from both pantheons, with elaborate ceremonies marking the integration of divine hierarchies that reflected the political realities of the unified empire. Scribal schools taught students to read and write in both languages, creating a generation of administrators capable of governing a truly cosmopolitan state. As the final independent city-states bowed before Sargon's expanding authority, the landscape of Mesopotamia had been fundamentally altered. Where once dozens of separate political entities had maintained their jealous independence, now a single authority stretched from the Persian Gulf to the headwaters of the great rivers. The sight of Akkadian banners flying from temple towers that had known only local emblems marked the birth of a new age, while in palace courtyards throughout the empire, tribute bearers from distant lands brought exotic goods and strange stories to the court of the world's first emperor. The transformation was complete, and humanity had taken its first tentative steps toward the creation of truly imperial civilizations. With the great Sumerian cities now under his dominion, Sargon of Akkad found himself ruler of a realm unlike any that had existed before in human history. The ancient world had known conquerors and kings, tribal chiefs who expanded their territories, and city rulers who absorbed neighboring settlements. But what emerged from Sargon's conquests was something entirely unprecedented, a vast tapestry of peoples, languages, and cultures bound together under a single crown. The Akkadian Empire stretched like a great river across the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, its tributaries reaching into distant valleys and highland regions, where different tongues echoed through mountain passes, and foreign gods received their ancient offerings. Within the empire's expanding borders lived the proud Sumerians, inventors of writing and masters of irrigation, their ziggurats still rising toward heaven from cities whose names had already become legend. The cuneiform tablets that recorded their laws and literature continued to emerge from scribal schools, though now these same scribes increasingly found themselves serving Akkadian administrators who spoke with northern accents and honored different customs. Alongside these southern urbanites dwelt the Akkadians themselves, those Semitic-speaking peoples from the central regions who had provided Sargon with his original power base. Their pastoral traditions and trading networks now elevated to imperial prominence. Far to the north, in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains, lived the Gutians and other hill peoples whose warriors had long descended upon the river valleys in search of plunder and seasonal grazing lands. These fierce mountain folk, with their distinctive pottery and bronze-working techniques, now found themselves either absorbed into the empire's military structure or held at bay by its frontier garrisons. Their knowledge of highland passes and their skill with horses made them valuable allies, though their fierce independence and clan loyalties required careful management from Akkadian governors who understood that ruling such people demanded both strength and diplomatic finesse. The empire's western reaches encompassed Amorite tribes whose nomadic traditions had carried them across the Great Steppes for generations, their flocks and herds moving in eternal cycles between winter and summer pastures. These desert peoples brought with them their own oral traditions, their star lore, and their intimate knowledge of wells and caravan routes that connected distant oasis settlements. Their integration into the imperial system created new possibilities for long-distance trade, as merchants could now travel under Akkadian protection across territories that had previously required complex negotiations with dozens of different tribal leaders and petty kings. Along the empire's eastern frontiers, in the regions that bordered the mysterious lands beyond the Great Mountains, lived Elamite peoples whose civilization was already ancient when Sargon first gazed upon Kish from the reed marshes of his birth. These sophisticated societies had developed their own systems of administration and record-keeping, their own pantheons of deities, and their own architectural traditions that reflected the unique challenges of their highland environment. The absorption of Elamite territories brought the empire not only strategic depth, but also access to mineral resources, copper and tin deposits that were essential for bronze production, precious stones that adorned royal regalia, and exotic woods that grew only in specific mountain valleys. The genius of the Akkadian administrative system lay not in its attempt to impose uniformity upon this remarkable diversity, but rather in its development of structures that could accommodate and channel the different strengths that each people brought to the imperial project. Local customs and religious practices continued largely undisturbed, with Akkadian governors learning to work through existing power structures rather than dismantling them entirely. Sumerian priests continued their ancient rituals. Amorite chieftains retained their traditional authority over their followers, and Elamite nobles found themselves integrated into a broader aristocratic network that spanned the known world. This pragmatic approach to imperial governance created a complex web of relationships that held the empire together through shared interests rather than mere force. Sumerian agricultural techniques spread northward into regions where they had never been tried before, while northern pastoral practices influenced southern approaches to animal husbandry. The empire became a vast laboratory of cultural exchange, where technologies and ideas flowed along trade routes that were now protected by Akkadian law and Akkadian soldiers. The languages of the empire created their own fascinating pattern of interaction and mutual influence. While Akkadian gradually emerged as the lingua franca of administration and long-distance trade, Sumerian retained its prestige as the language of learning and religious ceremony. In the markets of the great cities, merchants conducted business in a polyglot mixture of tongues, with interpreters and translators becoming valuable specialists whose services were essential for the smooth functioning of imperial commerce. Children grew up trilingual or even quadrilingual, equally comfortable discussing astronomical observations in Sumerian, negotiating trade agreements in Akkadian, and participating in tribal councils in their ancestral languages. Religious life within the empire reflected this same pattern of diversity within unity. The great Mesopotamian pantheon expanded to accommodate deities from conquered territories, with careful theological work being done to identify correspondences between different divine figures and to establish proper protocols for their worship. A mountain god from the Zagros might find himself identified with a Sumerian deity of similar attributes, while maintaining his own distinct cult centers and ritual calendar. This syncretic approach to religion helped to legitimize Akkadian rule among conquered peoples, while avoiding the religious conflicts that might otherwise have destabilized the empire. The imperial capital itself became a living embodiment of this multi-ethnic character. Akkad grew beyond its original boundaries to accommodate representatives from every corner of the empire, its streets filled with the aromas of different cuisines and the sounds of different musical traditions. Diplomatic compounds housed foreign dignitaries who had come to negotiate treaties or arrange marriages between noble houses, while merchant quarters specialized in goods from specific regions. Sumerian textiles in one district, highland metalwork in another, western livestock in yet another area. This cosmopolitan atmosphere attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the empire and beyond, creating an unprecedented concentration of knowledge and skill. New techniques in metallurgy emerged from the collaboration between different traditions, while artistic styles began to show the influence of multiple cultural streams. The royal workshops produced objects that displayed a sophisticated fusion of design elements, incorporating Sumerian geometric patterns with Akkadian figurative work and exotic materials from the empire's furthest reaches. The military structure of the empire reflected the same integrative approach, with Akkadian commanders learning to deploy the different fighting styles and specializations of their diverse subjects. Sumerian heavy infantry, trained in the disciplined phalanx formations that had dominated city-state warfare, formed the solid core of imperial armies. Akkadian archers provided devastating missile fire, while Amorite cavalry exploited their mobility and knowledge of desert warfare. Mountain peoples contributed their expertise in siege warfare and their intimate knowledge of difficult terrain, creating a combined arms approach that proved devastatingly effective against enemies who were accustomed to facing more homogeneous forces. Trade flourished under this new imperial umbrella as never before, with goods flowing freely across boundaries that had previously been defended by suspicious city-states and hostile tribes. Caravans that once required armed escorts and complex tribute arrangements could now travel under imperial protection, their merchants carrying standardized weights and measures that facilitated commerce across vast distances. The empire's roads, maintained by corvée labor drawn from all ethnic groups, became arteries of communication and commerce that bound the diverse territories together in networks of mutual dependence and shared prosperity. The sprawling territories that now answered to Sargon's rule demanded something unprecedented in human history: a completely new approach to the art of war and the science of governance. Where previous city-states had relied on familiar patterns of local militia and seasonal campaigns, the Akkadian Empire required a military machine capable of projecting power across vast distances, maintaining order among diverse populations, and adapting to the varied terrains and cultures that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean highlands. The bronze-tipped spears that had served adequately for defending a single city's walls would prove woefully inadequate for the monumental task of holding together this first great empire of the world. Sargon's military innovations began with the fundamental reimagining of the soldier himself. The traditional Sumerian phalanx, with its dense formations of citizen warriors bearing heavy bronze spears and leather shields, gave way to something far more flexible and deadly: the composite bow army that would become the hallmark of Akkadian dominance. These weren't the simple hunting bows familiar to marsh dwellers and desert nomads, but sophisticated weapons crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, each component carefully selected and seasoned over months before being bound together with specially prepared adhesives. The result was a weapon capable of sending arrows with lethal force across distances that rendered traditional spear formations obsolete, their bronze points piercing leather and bronze alike with devastating effectiveness. The transformation extended far beyond mere weaponry into the very soul of military organization. Where Sumerian armies assembled seasonally, disbanding after brief campaigns to return to their fields and workshops, Sargon created something entirely new: a standing professional army whose loyalty belonged not to individual cities or local gods, but to the empire itself and the person of its ruler. These soldiers lived in purpose-built barracks, trained year-round in complex maneuvers, and developed an esprit de corps that transcended the traditional bonds of family and locality that had defined earlier military service. Their bronze armor bore the insignia of the empire rather than local deities, and their battle standards carried the image of Sargon's divine mandate across landscapes that had never before seen such unified military might. The logistics of maintaining such a force across the empire's vast expanse revealed another dimension of Akkadian innovation: the development of the ancient world's first truly systematic military supply network. Long caravans of pack animals and human porters moved in carefully coordinated patterns, carrying not just weapons and armor, but the standardized rations, medical supplies, and replacement equipment that kept the imperial army functioning far from home. These supply lines followed routes that had been carefully surveyed and mapped, with way stations established at regular intervals where fresh animals could be obtained, and damaged equipment repaired by traveling smiths who carried portable forges and anvils designed specifically for field maintenance. The administrative genius that paralleled these military innovations represented an equally revolutionary departure from traditional governance. The Sumerian city-state model, with its divine kings ruling over relatively homogeneous populations, sharing common languages, customs, and religious practices, simply could not accommodate the bewildering diversity of the Akkadian Empire. Sargon's solution involved the creation of the world's first truly imperial bureaucracy, a complex hierarchy of appointed officials whose authority derived not from local tradition or religious sanction, but from their position within a rationally organized administrative structure that could function effectively across cultural and linguistic boundaries. At the heart of this system lay the innovation of standardized record-keeping, conducted not in the traditional Sumerian script that remained tied to specific religious and cultural contexts, but in Akkadian cuneiform, adapted specifically for administrative efficiency. Thousands of clay tablets flowed through the imperial bureaucracy, recording tax assessments, military recruitment quotas, trade regulations, and judicial decisions in formats that could be understood and processed by officials stationed anywhere from the Zagros Mountains to the Levantine coast. These weren't simply local records copied and distributed, but documents created according to empire-wide standards that allowed for unprecedented coordination and control across vast distances. The territorial administration itself reflected this systematic approach through the appointment of governors whose authority combined military command, judicial oversight, and economic management within clearly defined geographic boundaries. These weren't traditional priest-kings ruling through divine mandate, but professional administrators selected for their competence and loyalty to the imperial system. They commanded local garrisons of Akkadian troops, supervised the collection of tribute and taxes according to standardized assessments, and enforced imperial law while respecting local customs that didn't conflict with broader imperial interests. Their residences, built according to architectural plans developed in Akkad itself, served as centers of imperial authority that projected Sargonian power through their very design and decoration. The economic innovations that supported this administrative apparatus revealed yet another dimension of Akkadian genius: the development of sophisticated systems for managing tribute, taxation, and trade across the empire's diverse economic zones. Different regions contributed to the imperial treasury according to their particular strengths and resources: grain and dates from the irrigated fields of Mesopotamia, timber and precious metals from the mountain territories, manufactured goods and textiles from established urban centers, and exotic products from distant trading partners who recognized the benefits of accommodation with this new imperial power. The careful calibration of these contributions, according to regional capabilities and seasonal variations, required unprecedented levels of economic planning and administrative sophistication. Perhaps most remarkably, the Akkadian system managed to balance imperial unity with regional diversity through innovations in cultural policy that would influence empire building for millennia to come. Rather than imposing uniform cultural practices across all territories, Sargon's administration developed a nuanced approach that maintained imperial loyalty while respecting local traditions. Local deities continued to receive worship in their traditional forms, but were incorporated into a broader imperial pantheon that acknowledged the supremacy of Akkadian gods without completely displacing regional religious practices. Local languages remained in use for daily commerce and local administration, while Akkadian served as the lingua franca for imperial business and interregional communication. The legal innovations that emerged from this cultural accommodation created the ancient world's first systematic approach to governing diverse populations under unified imperial law. Rather than imposing a single legal code across all territories, Akkadian administrators developed flexible frameworks that allowed local legal traditions to continue operating within imperial guidelines. Serious crimes against imperial authority, military service obligations, and major commercial disputes fell under standardized imperial jurisdiction, while family law, local property disputes, and traditional social relationships remained subject to local customs and practices. This sophisticated balance between imperial unity and regional autonomy required legal officials trained in multiple traditions and capable of navigating complex jurisdictional questions with wisdom and diplomacy. The communication networks that bound this vast administrative apparatus together represented perhaps the most impressive achievement of Akkadian organizational genius. Swift messengers carried imperial dispatches along well-maintained routes that connected even the most remote provincial centers with the imperial capital. These weren't casual arrangements dependent on local goodwill, but systematically organized networks with regularly spaced way stations, replacement horses and provisions, and standardized procedures for handling different categories of imperial correspondence. The most urgent military and administrative communications could cross the entire empire in a matter of weeks rather than months, enabling a degree of central coordination that had never before been attempted in human history. The architectural legacy of this administrative revolution became visible in the standardized fortifications, administrative complexes, and ceremonial structures that rose throughout the empire, each bearing the unmistakable stamp of Akkadian imperial design, while incorporating local materials and aesthetic elements. These buildings served not merely functional purposes, but symbolic ones as well, their imposing presence reminding local populations of the empire's power, while demonstrating its commitment to permanent governance rather than temporary occupation. The integration of local architectural traditions with imperial design principles created a distinctive imperial style that influenced construction throughout the ancient Near East for generations to come, long after the Akkadian Empire itself had passed into the realm of legend and memory. The military machine that Sargon had forged and the administrative brilliance that held his empire together created the foundation for something unprecedented in human history. A golden age that would stretch across the known world like the gentle light of dawn spreading over the Mesopotamian plains. The decades following the consolidation of Akkadian power witnessed a flowering of civilization that transformed not merely the lands between the rivers, but the very concept of what human society could achieve when unified under a single, visionary rule. Trade routes that had once been fragmented pathways connecting isolated city-states now became the arteries of a vast commercial empire, pulsing with the lifeblood of commerce that flowed from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean shores. Akkadian merchants, protected by the might of Sargon's armies and enabled by the standardized systems his administrators had implemented, ventured forth with unprecedented confidence into lands that had previously been the realm of dangerous speculation. Their caravans wound through mountain passes where the air grew thin and crystalline, laden with goods that spoke of distant wonders. Lapis lazuli from the Hindu Kush mountains, its deep blue surface flecked with gold like stars scattered across a midnight sky, cedar wood from the Lebanese highlands that filled entire valleys with its aromatic presence, and silver from Anatolia that gleamed like captured moonlight in the hands of skilled craftsmen. The great ziggurat of Akkad itself became a beacon, drawing merchants from every corner of the known world, its stepped sides rising toward the heavens like a man-made mountain that proclaimed the empire's prosperity to all who beheld it. Within the shadow of this monumental achievement, markets sprawled in organized abundance, their awnings creating a patchwork of shade where the sounds of dozens of languages mingled with the musical chiming of scales and the soft rustle of precious fabrics being unfurled for inspection. The standardized weights and measures that Akkadian administrators had imposed throughout the empire meant that a merchant from distant Elam could conduct business with a trader from the Syrian highlands using the same bronze standards, the same carefully calibrated systems that eliminated the confusion and mistrust that had plagued international commerce for centuries. Cultural exchange flowed along these trade routes, like water finding its natural course, carrying ideas and artistic innovations across vast distances with the same ease that it transported material goods. Akkadian scribes, masters of the cuneiform writing system that had been refined and standardized throughout the empire, found themselves documenting not merely administrative records and royal proclamations, but the stories, myths, and wisdom of peoples from the farthest reaches of Sargon's domain. The epic tales that would later inspire the great literary works of Mesopotamia began to take shape during this period, as court poets wove together narrative threads drawn from Sumerian mythology, Semitic folklore, and the accumulated wisdom of scholars who had traveled the length and breadth of the empire. In the workshops and ateliers that clustered around every major Akkadian city, artisans pushed the boundaries of their crafts with an energy born of prosperity and cultural confidence. Bronze workers, supplied with tin from distant mountains, and copper from mines that had been brought under imperial control created objects of unprecedented sophistication. Weapons whose surfaces were inlaid with silver and gold in patterns that told stories of conquest and glory. Ceremonial vessels whose forms echoed the natural world, while displaying technical mastery that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge. And jewelry that incorporated precious stones from across the known world into designs that would influence artistic traditions for millennia to come. The cylinder seals that had long been a hallmark of Mesopotamian craftsmanship reached new heights of artistic achievement during the Akkadian Golden Age, their minute carved surfaces containing entire worlds of narrative detail that could be pressed into clay to create images of gods and heroes, animals and mythical creatures, all rendered with a precision that testified to the skill of artists working at the height of their civilization's power. The Akkadian language itself became the diplomatic tongue of the ancient world during this period, its script appearing on tablets discovered in archaeological sites from Iran to Turkey, from Syria to the Persian Gulf. Palace archives throughout the empire preserved correspondence that reveals the sophisticated diplomatic relationships Sargon and his successors maintained with rulers whose domains stretched far beyond the traditional boundaries of Mesopotamian influence. These documents, inscribed with the careful strokes of professional scribes, record treaties and trade agreements, marriage negotiations between royal houses, and the complex ceremonial exchanges that bound the various peoples of the ancient Near East into a web of mutual obligation and shared prosperity. Religious syncretism flourished under Akkadian rule, as the empire's polytheistic flexibility allowed local deities to be incorporated into a broader pantheon that reflected the diversity of peoples under imperial control. The great goddess Ishtar, whose worship had deep roots in both Sumerian and Semitic traditions, became a unifying figure whose temples served as centers not only of religious observance but of economic activity. Their priesthoods, managing vast estates and conducting the complex financial transactions that kept the empire's economy functioning smoothly. These temple complexes, with their soaring walls and courtyards that could accommodate thousands of worshippers, became showcases for Akkadian architectural innovation. Their builders, drawing upon construction techniques and decorative traditions from across the empire to create structures that represented the synthesis of multiple cultural influences. Agricultural innovation reached unprecedented levels as Akkadian engineers applied the organizational principles that had proven so successful in military and administrative contexts to the challenge of feeding a population that had grown prosperous under imperial rule. Irrigation networks were extended and refined, their channels carrying life-giving water across hundreds of miles of previously marginal land, while agricultural techniques developed in one region of the empire were systematically transmitted to others through the movement of specialist farmers and the circulation of technical knowledge. The result was an agricultural surplus that not only supported the growing urban populations of major Akkadian cities, but also provided the foundation for the military campaigns and monumental construction projects that projected imperial power across the ancient world. The royal court at Akkad itself became a center of learning and artistic patronage that drew scholars and craftsmen from every corner of the known world, their presence creating an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that would influence the development of Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. Court astronomers, building upon centuries of Sumerian observation and record-keeping, refined their understanding of celestial movements to a degree of precision that allowed them to predict eclipses and track the complex cycles of planetary motion. Their carefully maintained records, inscribed on tablets that were copied and recopied by generations of scribes, would eventually provide the foundation for the astronomical achievements of later Babylonian civilization. The wealth that flowed into Akkadian coffers during this golden age funded construction projects that transformed the landscape of Mesopotamia itself. As royal architects designed and built structures that proclaimed the empire's power and sophistication to both contemporary observers and future generations. Palace complexes that covered entire city districts rose from the alluvial soil, their walls decorated with carved reliefs that depicted the triumphs of Akkadian arms and the abundance that imperial rule had brought to the lands between the rivers. These monuments, built to endure across the centuries, employed construction techniques that represented the culmination of millennia of Mesopotamian architectural development, their builders drawing upon the collective expertise of craftsmen whose families had been perfecting their skills for generations under the patronage of increasingly powerful rulers. The golden threads of Akkadian prosperity wove themselves into an ever-expanding tapestry of conquest and administration as power passed to a new generation of rulers who would push the boundaries of the known world further than any had dared before. In the shadow of great-grandfather Sargon's achievements, a young prince named Naram-Sin ascended to the throne around 2254 BCE, carrying with him the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of empire builders and the burning ambition to surpass them all. The cuneiform tablets of his era speak of a ruler whose very name meant beloved of Sin, the moon god, and whose reign would stretch across 4 decades of relentless expansion and unprecedented territorial control. The empire that Naram-Sin inherited was already vast, beyond the comprehension of earlier ages. Its borders, encompassing the fertile crescents of the Tigris and Euphrates, the trading cities of Syria, and the mountain passes that led to distant lands rich with metals and precious stones. Yet this inheritance, magnificent as it was, served merely as the foundation for conquests that would extend Akkadian influence from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the mineral-rich highlands of Iran. The administrative machinery developed by his predecessors hummed with efficiency, processing tribute from dozens of subject peoples, coordinating the movement of armies across impossible distances, and maintaining the delicate networks of loyalty and fear that held such a disparate collection of territories together under a single crown. The royal palace at Akkad during Naram-Sin's reign became a wonder that drew visitors from the ends of the earth. Its halls filled with the spoils of conquest and the artistic achievements of a dozen conquered cultures. Massive cedar beams, imported from the mountains of Lebanon, supported ceilings decorated with precious metals hammered into intricate patterns by craftsmen whose skills had been honed in the workshops of distant cities. The throne room itself stretched across vast expanses of polished stone. Its walls lined with reliefs depicting the king's victories over enemies whose names had once struck terror into the hearts of merchants and farmers, but who now served merely as decorative motifs, celebrating Akkadian supremacy. Gardens, designed by engineers who had studied the irrigation systems of multiple river valleys, created oases of green within the palace complex, their fountains fed by aqueducts that demonstrated the empire's mastery over water, that most precious of desert resources. The military campaigns that defined Naram-Sin's reign unfolded with a methodical precision that reflected generations of accumulated strategic knowledge and tactical innovation. His armies moved across the landscape like great rivers in flood, overwhelming fortified cities through combinations of siege warfare, diplomatic pressure, and the sheer psychological impact of Akkadian military reputation. The bronze weapons carried by his soldiers gleamed with the perfection of advanced metallurgy, while their organization followed patterns of command and control that allowed for coordinated movements across vast distances and challenging terrain. Supply trains stretching for miles carried everything from grain and oil to spare weapons and siege equipment, their efficient operation making possible campaigns that penetrated deep into previously unconquered territories and maintained pressure on enemy positions for months at a time. The conquest of the Zagros Mountains represented perhaps the most ambitious undertaking of Naram-Sin's military career, requiring his forces to master terrain that had previously served as an impenetrable barrier between the civilized world and the tribal peoples beyond. Mountain paths barely wide enough for pack animals became highways for entire armies as Akkadian engineers carved roads through solid rock and built bridges across gorges that had never before been spanned by human construction. The tribal confederations that controlled these highlands discovered that their traditional advantages of terrain and local knowledge proved insufficient against the disciplined professionalism of imperial forces, backed by sophisticated logistical systems and guided by intelligence networks that had been decades in development. Trade routes that had operated for centuries under local control found themselves reorganized according to imperial priorities. Their ancient rhythms altered to serve the needs of an administrative system that thought in continental terms rather than regional ones. Caravans that had once followed traditional paths dictated by seasonal weather patterns and tribal agreements now moved according to schedules designed to maximize imperial revenues and ensure strategic materials reached military and civilian administrators when needed. The great trading cities of Syria submitted to Akkadian authority not through conquest alone, but through the irresistible logic of economic integration. Their merchant classes, recognizing that participation in imperial commerce networks offered opportunities for wealth that dwarfed anything achievable through independent operation. The eastern campaigns that brought Akkadian control to regions beyond the Zagros Mountains opened territories rich with copper, silver, and other minerals essential to maintaining the technological superiority upon which imperial dominance depended. Mining operations established under direct royal supervision extracted unprecedented quantities of raw materials that fed the workshops and armories of the empire, while also providing the surplus wealth that funded further expansion and supported the elaborate administrative apparatus required to govern such vast territories. Local populations in these newly conquered regions found their traditional economic activities integrated into imperial production systems that offered both opportunities and obligations previously unknown in their experience. Administrative innovations developed during Naram-Sin's reign addressed the unprecedented challenges of governing territories that spanned multiple climate zones, linguistic groups, and cultural traditions. The cuneiform writing system, originally developed for Sumerian record-keeping, evolved into a versatile tool for imperial communication that could accommodate multiple languages while maintaining standardized formats for legal documents, tribute records, and military dispatches. Provincial governors, drawn from both Akkadian nobility and local elites, created hybrid administrative cultures that combined imperial efficiency with regional knowledge. Their courts serving as centers where different traditions merged into new forms of governmental practice. The king's relationship with the divine realm underwent transformation during this period of maximum territorial expansion, with Naram-Sin eventually claiming divine status in a move that reflected both the unprecedented nature of his achievements and the practical requirements of ruling over peoples whose religious traditions demanded divine sanction for temporal authority. Temple complexes built during his reign incorporated architectural elements and decorative motifs drawn from across the empire, creating sacred spaces that served as visual representations of imperial unity, while acknowledging the diverse spiritual traditions of subject peoples. The great victory stele commissioned to commemorate his triumph over the Lulubi people depicted the king wearing the horned crown of divinity while trampling enemies beneath his feet, the carved stone serving as both artistic masterpiece and political statement about the nature of imperial power. Cultural synthesis flourished during this period of maximum territorial extent, as artists, craftsmen, and scholars from diverse backgrounds gathered in major imperial centers to create works that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Naram-Sin's realm. Cylinder seals produced in royal workshops combined traditional Mesopotamian imagery with motifs drawn from Persian, Anatolian, and Syrian artistic traditions, their miniature scenes capturing the cultural complexity of an empire that encompassed multiple civilizations. Literary works composed during this era drew upon the mythological traditions of numerous peoples, weaving together creation stories, heroic legends, and historical accounts into narrative tapestries that reflected the unprecedented geographical scope of Akkadian influence. The empire at its territorial peak under Naram-Sin represented humanity's first successful attempt to organize vast portions of the known world under unified political control, its borders encompassing regions whose combined populations, resources, and cultural diversity exceeded anything previously achieved in human history. From the administrative centers where scribes recorded tribute payments from dozens of subject territories, to the frontier garrisons where soldiers maintained watch over the empire's farthest boundaries, the machinery of imperial governance operated with a complexity and efficiency that would not be matched for centuries to come, its methods and innovations providing templates for empire builders throughout subsequent ages. The mountain winds carried whispers of change across the vast territories that Naram-Sin had stretched to their furthest limits, and in the sacred precincts of ancient temples, priests began to murmur of divine displeasure. The great king, who had proclaimed himself a god, now faced the most insidious enemy an empire could encounter, the withdrawal of celestial favor that had blessed his grandfather Sargon's conquests generations before. In the shadowed corners of ziggurats from Babylon to Susa, religious authorities watched the signs with growing unease, interpreting the subtle shifts in political fortune as manifestations of cosmic imbalance. The very act of Naram-Sin's self-deification had torn at the delicate fabric that bound earthly power to divine sanction in Mesopotamian consciousness. For millennia, the relationship between rulers and gods had followed established patterns, with kings serving as earthly representatives of celestial will, rather than claiming godhood outright. When Naram-Sin adorned himself with the horned crown of divinity and demanded worship alongside Enlil and Marduk, he violated ancient protocols that governed the intersection of mortal ambition and divine authority. The tremors of this transgression rippled outward through the empire's religious infrastructure, creating fractures that would prove more damaging than any military defeat. Temple economies throughout Akkadian territories began to experience disruptions as local priests questioned their loyalty to a monarch who claimed equality with their traditional deities. The great ziggurats of Nippur and Babylon, which had served as pillars supporting imperial ideology, became centers of subtle resistance where ancient rituals took on new meanings of defiance. Scribes recording temple inventories noted shortfalls in offerings, while astronomical priests reported celestial omens that spoke of impending catastrophe. The elaborate ceremonies that had once reinforced the divine mandate of Akkadian rule gradually transformed into hollow performances, their spiritual power dissipated by the contradiction at the empire's heart. Rebellions that erupted across the empire's periphery carried religious undertones that made them particularly dangerous to imperial stability. Local populations, encouraged by their priests to see Akkadian rule as an affront to their ancestral gods, began to interpret every military setback as evidence of divine judgment against the blasphemous dynasty. The Gutians descending from the Zagros Mountains fought not merely as raiders seeking plunder, but as instruments of cosmic correction sent to humble the god-king who had overreached his mortal bounds. Their victories resonated with supernatural significance that transformed simple tribal conflicts into holy wars against Akkadian hegemony. The curse that ancient sources would later attribute to this period manifested first in the subtle erosion of administrative efficiency that had once made the empire function seamlessly across vast distances. Royal messengers found themselves unwelcome in cities where local governors had begun to question the legitimacy of orders issued by a ruler who claimed divinity. Trade routes that had channeled wealth toward Akkad for generations experienced mysterious disruptions as merchant caravans encountered bandits, emboldened by religious authorities, who proclaimed the empire's wealth to be cursed. The intricate system of provincial taxation that funded imperial armies began to falter as regional administrators discovered excuses to delay or reduce their contributions to the central treasury. Agricultural production across Mesopotamian heartlands suffered as farmers, influenced by priestly pronouncements about divine anger, began to interpret crop failures and livestock diseases as signs that the gods had withdrawn their blessing from Akkadian soil. The great irrigation networks that Sargon had expanded and maintained required constant cooperation between communities that now viewed imperial authority with suspicion. Canals silted up when neighboring settlements refused to coordinate maintenance efforts, while disputes over water rights escalated into violent conflicts that imperial governors found increasingly difficult to mediate. The abundance that had sustained Akkadian expansion for over a century gradually gave way to scarcity that weakened the empire's ability to project power beyond its borders. Environmental challenges that previous generations of Akkadian rulers might have weathered through efficient administration and religious unity became existential threats in the atmosphere of spiritual crisis that surrounded Naram-Sin's later years. Drought cycles that affected the entire region hit Akkadian territories particularly hard, as local populations proved reluctant to implement emergency measures coordinated by imperial authorities. The sophisticated granary system that had once buffered the empire against famine began to fail when regional officials hoarded supplies for their own populations rather than redistributing resources according to imperial directives. Archaeological evidence suggests that even palace complexes in major cities experienced food shortages as the logistics of empire collapsed under the weight of religious discord. Military campaigns that had once been celebrated as glorious extensions of divine will became costly endeavors that drained imperial resources without securing lasting victories. Akkadian armies found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who drew strength from religious conviction, making each battle more expensive in both material and spiritual terms. The professional soldiers who had conquered the known world under Sargon and his successors began to question their loyalty to commanders who claimed godhood while presiding over an empire in decline. Desertion rates increased as troops from peripheral territories abandoned their units to return to homelands where local priests promised divine protection against imperial retribution. The Great Library at Akkad, repository of administrative wisdom accumulated over generations of imperial rule, began to record omens and portents that painted an increasingly dark picture of dynastic prospects. Royal astronomers, whose predecessors had read the stars to guide imperial policy, now found celestial configurations that spoke only of disaster and divine displeasure. The sophisticated system of record-keeping that had enabled Akkadian administration across vast distances became a chronicle of decline as scribes documented rebellions, natural disasters, and economic collapse with meticulous precision. These tablets, preserved in royal archives, would later be interpreted by Mesopotamian historians as evidence that the gods themselves had pronounced judgment on the Akkadian experiment. Cultural memory of this period crystallized around the concept of divine retribution that transformed the Akkadian collapse from a political event into a moral lesson about the dangers of hubris. Later Mesopotamian literature would preserve stories of how the gods conspired to bring down the empire that had grown too proud, sending drought and invasion to humble the dynasty that had forgotten its place in the cosmic order. The tale of Akkadian decline became a cautionary narrative about the limits of earthly ambition and the inevitable consequences of challenging divine authority. These stories, passed down through generations of scribes and storytellers, ensured that the memory of Akkad's religious conflicts would resonate throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The curse that descended upon Akkad in its final years represented more than simple political misfortune. It embodied the fundamental tension between imperial ambition and traditional religious authority that would haunt every subsequent attempt at universal rule in the ancient world. The empire that had begun with Sargon's vision of divinely sanctioned conquest ended in the spiritual chaos that followed when his great-grandson claimed equality with the gods themselves. As the political structure of Akkadian rule crumbled under external pressure and internal rebellion, the religious crisis that had precipitated its decline became the lens through which later civilizations would understand the rise and fall of earthly power. The whispers of divine displeasure that had haunted the later years of Akkadian rule would soon find their earthly companion in forces far beyond the control of any monarch or priest. As the 22nd century, before the Common Era drew toward its close, the very heavens themselves began to betray the empire that had once seemed destined to endure for all time. The curse of Akkad, so vividly described in the ancient texts as divine retribution for Naram-Sin's hubris, would manifest not merely in the form of barbarian invasions or civil strife, but in the most fundamental betrayal of all, the failure of the natural world itself to sustain the civilization that had grown to depend upon its predictable rhythms. The great rivers that had nurtured Mesopotamian civilization for millennia began their slow retreat from the lands they had faithfully watered since the dawn of agriculture. The Tigris and Euphrates, those twin arteries of life that had carried the fertile silts of distant mountains to create the rich alluvial plains of Sumer and Akkad, gradually diminished in their flow. What had once been a reliable annual cycle of flooding and recession became erratic, unpredictable, leaving farmers to stare helplessly at fields that cracked under the relentless sun. The intricate network of canals that represented centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge began to silt up, their maintenance requiring resources that were increasingly diverted to military campaigns and the desperate defense of shrinking territories. Archaeological evidence preserved in the sedimentary layers of ancient Mesopotamian sites tells a story of profound environmental transformation during this crucial period. Core samples drawn from the beds of long dry lakes reveal a dramatic shift in the composition of deposited materials, with layers of fine dust replacing the organic debris that had accumulated during the empire's prosperous centuries. The pollen record speaks of forests retreating, of grasslands withering, of the diverse ecosystem that had supported not only human civilization, but countless species of plants and animals contracting into isolated refuges along the diminishing waterways. The drought that descended upon the Akkadian lands was not the brief seasonal interruption that farmers had always learned to endure, but rather a sustained transformation of the climate itself that persisted for decades. Tree ring studies from specimens preserved in archaeological contexts show growth patterns that virtually cease during this period, the annual rings becoming so narrow as to be barely discernible, testimony to years when rainfall measured in precious drops rather than life-giving deluges. The great date palm groves that had provided both sustenance and building materials began to die back, their deep roots unable to reach water tables that had dropped far below their historical levels. Cities that had bustled with commerce and administration gradually emptied as their populations fled toward whatever sources of water could still be found. The urban centers that had been the pride of Akkadian civilization, with their towering ziggurats and sprawling administrative complexes, began to take on the hollow quality of abandoned shells. Dust accumulated in the courtyards where merchants had once haggled over prices for goods from distant lands. The workshops where skilled artisans had created the beautiful objects that archaeologists still uncover today fell silent, their tools abandoned as their makers departed in search of survival rather than beauty. The written records from this period, where they survive at all, speak with increasing desperation of failed harvests and empty granaries. Royal correspondence reveals the strain placed upon the administrative system as provincial governors reported crop failures and requested emergency supplies that the central government was increasingly unable to provide. The careful bookkeeping that had been one of the hallmarks of Akkadian administration gave way to terse emergency communiques, appeals for aid, and finally, in many cases, to silence itself as the infrastructure of record-keeping collapsed, along with the society it had served. Nomadic peoples who had long lived on the margins of settled civilization found themselves forced to move ever closer to the remaining sources of water, bringing them into inevitable conflict with the sedentary populations who were themselves struggling for survival. The archaeological record shows increasing signs of fortification and defensive measures during this period, as communities that had once relied on the protection of the imperial army were forced to defend themselves against increasingly desperate raids. The careful distinctions between civilized and barbarian that had defined Akkadian identity began to blur, as survival became the primary concern of all peoples, regardless of their cultural heritage. The great libraries and schools where scribes had preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization began to close their doors as resources were diverted to more immediate needs. The copying of texts that had ensured the survival of literary and scientific knowledge across generations ceased in many centers, and countless works that had taken centuries to develop were lost forever when the buildings that housed them were abandoned to the elements. The knowledge of astronomy that had allowed the Akkadians to predict eclipses and track the movements of planets gradually faded from memory as the observatories fell into disrepair and their learned keepers scattered to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Trade networks that had spanned continents began to contract as the resources necessary to maintain them were no longer available. The roads that had carried goods and ideas across the empire became unsafe as central authority weakened and local strongmen attempted to extract tribute from passing caravans. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated commerce throughout the Akkadian realm gave way to local systems as communities turned inward, focusing on survival rather than exchange. The cosmopolitan culture that had been one of the great achievements of the world's first empire fragmented into isolated pockets of population, each struggling with its own immediate crisis. Even the great capital cities began to show signs of abandonment as their populations dwindled and their magnificent buildings fell into disrepair. The palaces where kings had once held court over representatives from across the known world became empty monuments to vanished power. The temples, where priests had maintained the rituals that connected earth to heaven, saw their offerings reduced to meager scraps, as the faithful could no longer afford the elaborate ceremonies that had once been considered essential to cosmic order. The very foundations of Akkadian civilization, built upon the assumption of abundant water and fertile soil, crumbled as these fundamental prerequisites disappeared. The environmental catastrophe that struck the Akkadian Empire represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how even the mightiest human institutions remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The empire that had seemed to master the known world, that had developed the administrative and military techniques that would influence civilization for millennia to come, found itself as helpless as any village farmer when the rains failed to come and the rivers began their inexorable retreat toward the distant sea. The great cities of Akkad began their slow surrender to time around 2200 BCE, not with the thunderous crash of armies or the spectacular collapse of walls, but with the gradual whisper of abandonment that settles over civilizations like dust over ancient stones. The empire that had stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, that had unified the known world under a single crown, found itself fragmenting under pressures both earthly and celestial, as if the very forces that had conspired to create this marvel of human organization had turned their faces away. Climate records preserved in ice cores and sediment layers tell of a great aridification that swept across Mesopotamia during these final centuries, transforming the fertile plains that had nourished Sargon's dreams into increasingly barren expanses where crops withered and rivers ran shallow. The intricate network of canals that had carried life-giving water to distant provinces began to silt up, their maintenance requiring resources that a contracting empire could no longer provide. Agricultural yields declined steadily, and the surplus that had funded armies and administrators, scribes and artisans, slowly evaporated like morning dew under an unforgiving sun. The Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros ranges to the east, began their descent into the weakened heartland of Akkad, like wolves sensing the vulnerability of aging prey. These were not the organized armies of rival city-states with their bronze weapons and disciplined formations, but rather waves of pastoral nomads driven by their own environmental pressures, seeking new grazing lands and opportunities in the rich valleys below. They moved with the fluid persistence of water finding cracks in stone, infiltrating rather than conquering, settling in abandoned areas and gradually asserting control over trade routes and agricultural districts. Within the empire itself, the bonds that had held together this vast confederation began to fray as surely as rope left too long in desert winds. Provincial governors, once proud to serve the king, who was beloved of the gods, found themselves increasingly isolated from the imperial center, forced to rely on their own resources to maintain order and defend their territories. Local dialects reasserted themselves over the Akkadian tongue. Regional customs overcame imperial standardization, and the great bureaucracy that had been Sargon's lasting innovation began to collapse under its own administrative weight. The royal court at Akkad, that magnificent centre where tribute had once flowed from across the known world, became a shadow of its former glory. The great palace complex, with its audience halls capable of accommodating hundreds of supplicants, grew quiet save for the echoing footsteps of fewer and fewer courtiers. The scribal schools that had trained administrators for distant provinces found their students departing to serve local rulers rather than an increasingly powerless central authority. Even the temples, those bastions of divine legitimacy that had proclaimed the Akkadian kings as chosen of the gods, began to redirect their loyalties toward regional patrons who could still provide the resources necessary for proper worship and maintenance. King Shar-Kali-Shari, one of the last effective rulers of the dynasty, fought valiantly to preserve what remained of his ancestors' creation, leading campaign after campaign against the encroaching Gutians and rebellious provinces. Historical records describe his efforts to shore up the empire's defences, to reorganize the administration, to restore the old systems of tribute and loyalty that had sustained Akkadian power for nearly 2 centuries. Yet these efforts, however determined, proved insufficient against the combined pressures of environmental change, external invasion, and internal dissolution that were reshaping the entire region. Archaeological evidence from the final phase of Akkadian rule tells a story of gradual abandonment rather than violent destruction. Sites that had bustled with commercial activity show layers of wind-blown sand accumulating in marketplaces, of residential quarters slowly emptying as inhabitants migrated to more promising locations. The great workshops that had produced luxury goods for international trade fell silent, their kilns cold, their tools left scattered where artisans had finally set them down for the last time. Even the military installations, those frontier posts that had projected Akkadian power into distant territories, show signs of planned withdrawal rather than catastrophic defeat. The end, when it came, was more whimper than roar. The last kings of Akkad ruled over territories that had shrunk to little more than the original city-state that Sargon had inherited from his Sumerian predecessors. The vast network of alliances and tribute relationships that had once made the Akkadian monarch the most powerful ruler on earth dissolved into memory, leaving behind only scattered settlements and the echo of a great experiment in human organization that had briefly transformed the ancient world. Yet even as the political structure of the Akkadian Empire crumbled into dust, its deeper innovations had already become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of Mesopotamian civilization that they survived the collapse of their creators. The Akkadian language, rather than disappearing with the dynasty that had promoted it, became the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes would continue to write in variations of Akkadian long after the original empire had become merely a chapter in historical chronicles, preserving not only the language but the administrative techniques and legal concepts that had made Akkadian rule so effective. The governmental innovations pioneered by Sargon and refined by his successors became the template for every subsequent empire in the region. The Babylonians, who would eventually dominate southern Mesopotamia, adopted wholesale the Akkadian model of centralized administration, professional bureaucracy, and systematic record-keeping. The Assyrians, those fierce warriors who would later build an even more extensive empire, consciously modeled their imperial ideology on Akkadian precedents, even claiming descent from Sargon himself in their royal propaganda. The very concept of empire as a form of political organization, the idea that diverse peoples could be united under a single ruler while retaining their local customs and identities, became part of the political imagination of the ancient world. The artistic and cultural achievements of the Akkadian period proved equally enduring. The realistic style of sculpture that had emerged during Sargon's reign, with its emphasis on individual portraiture and naturalistic representation, influenced artistic traditions throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The epic literature that celebrated Akkadian heroes, particularly the stories surrounding Sargon himself, became part of a shared cultural heritage that connected peoples across vast distances and centuries. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover Akkadian-style artifacts in locations far removed from the original heartland, testament to the cultural influence that outlived political control. Perhaps most significantly, the Akkadian Empire had demonstrated that the ancient world was far more interconnected than anyone had previously imagined. The trade networks established during the imperial period continued to function long after the political authority that had created them had vanished, linking communities from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea in webs of commercial and cultural exchange. The technologies of communication and transportation that had enabled Akkadian administration were refined and passed down to successor civilizations, making possible even grander imperial projects in later centuries. The memory of Akkad lingered in the ancient imagination like the afterglow of a brilliant sunset. Later historians, writing in civilizations that Sargon could never have imagined, looked back on the Akkadian Empire as a golden age of unity and prosperity, a time when the known world had briefly come together under enlightened rule. Kings, separated from Sargon by millennia, invoked his name as a symbol of legitimate authority and imperial ambition, while common people told stories of the great conqueror who had risen from humble origins to rule the earth. Even today, as archaeologists carefully brush sand away from tablets and pottery sherds in the ruins of ancient cities, the Akkadian Empire continues to reveal its secrets and influence. Each discovery adds another piece to our understanding of humanity's first great experiment in imperial government, reminding us that the questions of how to govern diverse populations, how to balance central authority with local autonomy, how to maintain unity while respecting diversity, are as old as civilization itself. The empire that Sargon built with bronze weapons and cuneiform tablets may have crumbled back into the dust of Mesopotamia, but its echoes continue to resonate through the corridors of history, a testament to the enduring human capacity for both creation and adaptation in an ever-changing world.